Tales from the Crypt by Jack Oleck. Narrated by Chris Harvey. The most horrible sight that he would ever see was not inside the coffin, at least not only inside the coffin. It was on the rim of the coffin, on its polished wooden sides. Hanging over the rim of the coffin and pasted to its sides were strings of bloody tissue, and they were moving. "But you haven't killed him," he choked. His mouth writhed. The rest would not come. He had to force it. Every bit of him is still alive and suffering. Suffering! It took a long moment for that to burn itself into Enid's brain. Then she screamed, and she would continue to scream until merciful death released her. Jason did not move, did not look about him, but he could feel the others watching him. Only Rogers, locked in some private nightmare of his own, was turned away from him. Rogers was still staring at the door from which he had recoiled in such horror. After a moment, Rogers turned as if forcing himself to look into the monk's eyes. His hand gestured toward the now closed door. What did I see? What is the explanation for what I saw through there?" "Before you learn, there is one more person who must be given a vision. You. Then you will all know. All." The great glowing eyes widened even further. "You saw what lay behind the door, so you already know why I want to warn you." The eyes were a bottomless well. Rogers could hear the monk's voice, but only as if from a great distance, echoing, "Warn you, warn you, warn you." The home squatted at the end of a turn-off from the main road, a shapeless pile set down in the midst of overgrown, unkempt grounds. Even by day it had the desolate, uninviting look that such places always have. Badly in need of paint, neglected and forlorn, it was a last stopping place for men who had outlived their usefulness, a way station on the road to oblivion. Those who were responsible for its maintenance had long ago shrugged and given up any attempt to make it attractive. Why bother? The men who spun out their dreary days and nights in the home could not see it anyway. They were blind. Rogers had a panoramic view of the grimy pile as he drove toward it, and he did not like what he saw. Not because it mattered to him that the men in the home had been hidden, shunted out of the mainstream of life to await their ends in surroundings that reflected their own hopelessness, but because he was an orderly man. Not very attractive, eh, Brutus? There was a dog on the back seat of the car, a huge Alsatian with none of the usual good nature of its breed about it, jaws lolling open to reveal long, glistening fangs. Its answer was a growl. An attendant, as unkempt as the grounds, hurried to hold open the door of the car as soon as it pulled up at the front entrance of the home. "Welcome, sir, welcome. We were told to expect you." The man knew his place. Rogers nodded curtly with satisfaction, then turned to look about him. "Rather quiet, isn't it? Where is everybody?" "In the dining room, sir. Shall I take your luggage?" "No, it can wait. The dining room, eh? Ah, good. If I'm to run this place, it might be just as well for me to meet everyone at once. Lead the way." A few moments later he was standing in the doorway of the dining hall with Brutus at his heels and his nose crinkling with distaste as he savoured the room's atmosphere. The food that was being served to the men was plentiful, if coarse, but the cooks who had prepared it would hardly have qualified as chefs. The room itself was huge, a drab grey cavern with plaster walls from which the scabrous paint hung in strips and with windows so thick with dirt that it was difficult to see through them. Not that that mattered, of course, Rogers thought with unfeeling wryness. Not here. Methodically he continued his inspection of the room. Bare plank tables, wooden benches, chipped and broken crockery, a greasy serving counter. It was typical of him that he inspected the men themselves last of all. They sat hunched over their plates, murmuring to each other, some with dark glasses hiding their eyes, some staring straight ahead at nothing, each with a white cane by his side. Old men for the most part, thin to the point of emaciation, shapeless lumps in worn cast-off clothing. They ate without relish, slowly. Time was one commodity of which they still had more than enough. Only one of them was on his feet, a tall, cadaverous blind man, not so old as most of the others, whose plate had just been filled by a cook at the serving counter. He walked to his place at one of the plank tables, his cane dangling from his arm, and sat down. Brutus barked, his eyes fixed upon the man, and the murmur of conversation died. "Quiet, Brutus!" The sightless stares of the men were fixed upon Rogers now. The men had become aware of his presence. Unconsciously he tensed, squaring his shoulders and stiffening his spine into the erect posture that is the mark of the soldier. It was not too different, really, from addressing men in uniform. "Good morning. My name is William Rogers. I have been appointed your new superintendent. I take up my duties today." A renewed murmur of conversation greeted his announcement. Oddly, however, the men had turned their heads toward a corner of the room. Their blind stares were no longer for him, but for the man who had just taken his seat. Rogers guessed at once that the man was their leader. The attendant was still at his side. Rogers spoke to him without looking at him. "Who is that man?" Carter, sir." The murmur had drifted away into silence again. The men were waiting, expectant. "Well, I hope we will all get along well. If there are any complaints, I will be pleased to hear them in my office." The blind men returned to their eating. "Well?" The sharpness of Roger's tone took the attendant by surprise. The attendant had been watching Carter. "My office, man. Where is it?" "Oh, yes, sir. Yeah, this way, sir." The man hurried off, threading a path between the tables toward a door at the far end of the dining hall. Rogers, following, had the uncomfortable notion that he was walking between rows of sentient corpses, breathing but already dead. The silence was uncanny. When Brutus suddenly stopped in front of Carter and barked for the second time, the sound struck his eardrums like a pistol shot. "Brutus!" Brutus growled and came to heel. Where he passed, the blind men shied away nervously. But they did not speak until he and Rogers and the attendant had passed through the door and were in the hallway beyond. Then the murmuring renewed itself. Only Carter seemed to have nothing to say. He sat staring toward the hallway, lost in thought. In the hallway, the attendant led the way to the superintendent's office. Just inside it, Rogers came to a halt. The office was bare. Empty bookshelves, a desk and a chair, nothing else. Even the walls had been stripped. Rectangular patches, lighter than the time-darkened paint that surrounded them, showed where pictures had been taken down. "There were pictures on the walls," Rogers said. "Personal property of your predecessor, sir." The attendant felt somehow guilty. The new superintendent had about him an overbearing arrogance that seemed to imply that the attendant had been personally responsible for the removal of the pictures. "I see. Well, we shall have to get some others. I'll go down to London and choose them myself." "Yes, sir." "Well, that will be all for the moment." "Yes, sir." The attendant was happy to leave, but he closed the door behind him very softly. Rogers, he was certain, was not the kind of man who would take kindly to carelessness even in so small a thing as an unnecessarily slammed door. When the man had gone, Rogers surveyed his new domain with a critical eye. It was not the most attractive office he had ever seen, by no means. Still, his new position would have its compensations. Gradually his expression altered and his face took on a look of satisfaction, the same look that the obsequiousness of the attendant had inspired in him. He walked to the desk and sat down behind it, leaning back contentedly with both hands laid flat on its surface. For the first time since his arrival he smiled. Relaxed, he contemplated the future and the authority that was now firmly in his hands. There would be a great deal that needed doing, of course, a great many things that would most probably have to be changed, but Yes, definitely, he would be happy here. An hour later he departed for London. A man in his position required certain creature comforts, and rank had its privileges, did it not? The purchases that he made in London assured that he would live as he was accustomed to living, as a gentleman. The rest, the changes, required a while longer, but not too long. He had arrived with the cold winds of November at his back. By the middle of December things were well in hand. The residents of the home, had they been asked, would have attested wholeheartedly to the fact. In the dimly lit dormitory they huddled on their cots and shivered. One tiny bare bulb glowed in a ceiling socket, its light dissipated and lost long before it could reach across the cave-like room. After all, the dormitory was occupied by blind men, and the new superintendent was attempting to save money wherever he could. The lack of light was of little moment to the men. But when snow blankets the ground and the outside temperature hovers near zero, men, even blind men, do require heat. There was none. Those of the men who had taken to their cots found no warmth in the threadbare blankets in which they wrapped themselves. Their lips were blue and their breathing hung small clouds of vapour on the frigid air. A few, also wrapped in their blankets, huddled about the radiator. Carter was one of those who had not taken to his bed. His hand shook when he extended it to touch the radiator. His teeth were chattering when he spoke. "It's stone cold now. There's no heat coming up at all." There was no longer any point in clustering about the radiator. One by one the men began to drift away toward their cots, their white canes tapping. Carter was the last to go. His cane found the iron legs of the bed, but he did not lie down. His head had lifted in the way that blind men cock their heads when they hear something unusual. Still feeling with his stick, he turned to the cot beside his own and bent over it. The man who lay on the cot was old even by the standards of the home. Encased in his blanket, he was shivering as the others were shivering, but even more violently. The chattering of his teeth was not the intermittent chatter that now and then rattled the teeth of his companions. It was steady, insistent. Carter reached to touch the man. He could feel the iciness of the old body even through the worn cloth that covered it. "I'll get you an extra blanket." There was a cupboard at one end of the room. He walked to it as quickly as his blindness would permit. He knew every inch of the dormitory intimately, as he knew every inch of the home, but sometimes the attendants disturbed things, moved things about. His hand groped in the cabinet, but it found nothing. The shelf he had chosen was bare. His fingers dropped to the next shelf, and the next. Nothing. There was nothing. His face twisted, became agitated. There had been extra blankets in the cupboard, he was certain. There had been, and they were gone. Helplessly, as the anger and the frustration took him, he pounded his open palm on one of the bare shelves. Afterward, he lay on his cot with the anger still in him, thinking. It was up to him. The men would expect it. In the morning he went to Rogers's office with two others, a committee. Rogers at his desk could hear them as he approached along the hall. He was working on the home's books, and the approaching footsteps were a distraction. Ordinarily the office was as quiet as a tomb. It was well away from the dormitory and the so-called lounge that was nothing more than another bare room fitted up with a few sticks of sagging furniture. He was annoyed when there was a rap on the door. He did not want to see anyone just then, but there was no help for it. "Come in." Carter and two other men stood in the doorway. They came in hastily with Carter in the lead and closed the door behind them. They looked, Rogers thought, rather like staring scarecrows, completely out of place in the now luxuriously appointed office with its finely bound books and its new carpet and the expensively framed pictures that he had selected with such care. "Yes? The men have asked us to come and see you." Carter obviously was to be the group's spokesman. Rogers waited impatiently. There was a complaint in the offing. It was in every line of Carter's stance. "It's about the eating. It's been very cold the last few nights, and we've been wondering if—" Rogers did not permit him to finish. He had dealt with complaining subordinates before. There was just one way to handle them. Firmly. Give them a shilling and they would take £1. He made his voice a dismissal. "We turn off the heating at 8 in the winter. You know that. You should all be in bed by 8. The men did not move. Carter's lips had set stubbornly. "The beds are cold. There aren't enough blankets." He did not speak disrespectfully, but neither did he seem inclined to give ground. The martini in Rogers made him push his head forward, as he had been wont to do when dealing with recruits. It was a gesture that had never failed to intimidate. "I had the worn ones thrown out. We have no allowance for new ones in our budget for the current year. I'm trying to run this home as efficiently and as economically as I can." But these were not recruits, and they could not see his outthrust jaw. If they turned away, it was not because he had overawed them, but because they had known in advance the futility of their coming, because they had anticipated what his answer would be. Only Carter seemed to be visibly upset. Carter's shoulder brushed against one of the new pictures on the wall, tilted it on its cord. He hesitated, raised a hand to feel along the heavily carved frame. "Expensive?" He did not make the word an accusation. It was a question, no more. Even so, the question made Rogers uncomfortable. It's a picture." Carter was considering him almost as though he could see him. "Do you know anything about blind people?" Rogers shrugged. "I can't say that I've come across many before coming to this job, actually. I was an army officer, learned to handle men there." Carter spoke calmly, giving no hint of the effort at self-control behind his words. "With all due respect, sir, we are not soldiers, and blind men are not like people with sight. We've lost one of our senses, but the loss of one sense only tends to sharpen the others, to tune them more finely, to make them more acute. Do you know what that means?" Rogers did not know what it meant. He did not care. He had spent long years commanding men. It was one of his axioms that enlisted men were machines that required constant care if they were to be kept in fighting trim, and he had always attempted to see to it that his men were all well fed, well clothed and well housed. Efficiency demanded it. But these men, they were machines, yes, but they were old, worn-out machines that served no purpose, that consumed food and supplies to no end. He shrugged again. But Carter had not done. "We can feel things more easily. If food is bad, it tastes worse to us. If a room is dirty, we feel every speck. If an insect scurries across the floor, we hear it, and if it's cold, we feel the cold even more. So," Carter was still fingering the picture, "why not sell this and buy us some fuel? Or blankets?" The cheek of the man! Rogers was appalled. He would have felt just this same spasm of wrath, just this same disbelief if the troops under his command had suddenly mutinied. Inferior ranks simply did not tell an officer where his duty lay, and these were not even soldiers. They were useless husks living on the charity of others, worn-out shells waiting to die. Nevertheless, he did not dissolve into anger. He was angry, but it would not do to lose his dignity. "Look, I was not aware that the administration of expenditures for this institute had been turned over to you, Mr. Carter," he said. His tone was meant to bite, to hurt, and it succeeded. The faces of the two men who had accompanied Carter took on identical expressions of pain. There was no mistaking the fact that their mission had failed. They had anticipated that it would, but they had not anticipated Rogers's venom. "We've wasted our time." Carter's disappointment, unlike theirs, was tinged with quiet rage. He was biting his lip as he turned to the door and went out, with the others following close behind. Rogers remained motionless behind his desk. The interview had disturbed him even more than he had thought. There was something implacable about those staring, unseeing eyes of Carter's. It was a while before he returned to the books, and he did not at once set to work even then. It was only slowly that he was able to recover his usual self-assurance. He took up his pen. Perhaps it was just as well that the last few moments had taken place. At least the men would know now where they stood, where he stood. He was firmly in charge, in control, and they would abide by his decisions. He was quite certain that there would be no more committees. Nor were there. December, the coldest December in years, ground out its frigid days and unbearable nights, and the men did not return. They grew more restless, thinner, more emaciated, but they did not again intrude on his privacy. They suffered in silence and thought their hopeless thoughts, and Rogers neither knew nor cared. Order, that was the thing. It was not for nothing that he had been known in the army as a harsh disciplinarian. In time, he almost forgot that the men were indeed men. They were more ciphers in his account books. The men, however, had not forgotten him. His name, though he was not aware of it, was cursed daily, particularly at mealtimes. It was inevitable that, in time, there would be a small insurrection. It began in the dining hall when December had almost run its course, and it had to begin, with Carter. He stood at the serving counter holding out his dish, and the mess that the cook dumped into it made a loose swishing sound as it dropped from the ladle. The mess was supposedly meat stew, but if there was any meat in it, the meat was not visible. What was visible was a watery concoction as grey as the scabrous walls of the room. When he had taken his usual seat, Carter lifted a spoonful of the stew to his mouth and made a face. "Tastes like dishwater." The man beside him nodded. "No meat in it." It required an effort for Carter to consume the rest of the stew. It was thin and unsatisfying and bad-tasting, but he was hungry. An old man, the man for whom he had attempted to find an extra blanket, was the first to empty his dish. Fever spots burned brightly on his cheeks, and his cough now was as often as not accompanied by blood, but he had the greediness of old age. He stood up and carried the dish to the serving counter, but when he offered it, the cook behind the counter shook his head. The vat that had held the stew was empty. "Sorry, there's none left." The old man was querulous, ravenous. "No second helping? The rations were cut." The cook was not an unfeeling man. "Superintendent says he's doing the best he can with prices so high." His eyes moved past the old man to Carter. Carter was listening, and Carter's eyes made the cook uncomfortable, even though he knew that Carter could not see him. The old man returned to his seat at the table, carrying his empty dish and coughing. "There's no more," he said plaintively when he had recovered his breath. The words were directed to Carter as the table's natural leader, but there was no opportunity for Carter to reply. His head swiveled as he heard a noise from somewhere behind him, a sharp, distinctive pop. It had been a long time since he had heard that sound, but there was no mistaking it. It came from behind the door that led into the hallway and so to Rogers's office. The sound of a cork being drawn, followed a moment later by the familiar gurgle of liquid being poured from a bottle. Rogers was startled when the door to his office burst open. He was seated at his desk, a meal laid out before him. Steak, salad, vegetables, and a bottle of wine, and the inward-bursting door caught him with a forkful of the steak suspended midway between his plate and his mouth. Carter and some of the other blind men stood in the doorway. One of them sniffed appreciatively, savouring the aroma of the steak. "What do you want?" Carter, too, sniffed the aroma of the meat. His advance 2 steps into the room added a note of indignation to Rogers's voice. "It's my lunchtime." "What is it? A nice, juicy steak?" Anger had set Carter's body to quivering. "While we get nothing but slop?" His attitude was almost threatening as he advanced further into the room. For the moment, Rogers's temper took precedence over his indignation, but it was a temper slightly tinged with apprehension. "I do the best I can for you, within the limits of my budget, but you eat meat. You drink wine." 30 years of dealing with the ranks, 30 years of command put iron into Rogers's bitten-off reply. "Look, I am the officer in charge." Carter's rage burst its bounds. "Look, this isn't the bloody army." His cane lifted, swung in a hard, furious arc across the surface of the desk, sweeping away the bottle and the wineglass that stood beside it. The glass shivered into 100 pieces. The bottle overturned, smashed itself into bits on the carpet. Rogers pushed himself back from the desk, afraid. His face had gone white. "Brutus!" The dog, until now seated in a corner, came swiftly to its feet, its hackles rising. Head lowered and ears laid back, it moved toward Carter, growling. When it was close, the growling became a series of snarling barks. It was too well trained, too well fed to attack without being ordered to do so, but there was no mistaking the threat behind that vicious barking. Carter backed away. He had not known that the dog was in the office. He would have been helpless against it. When the dog came no farther, he turned to hurry out of the room, pushing through the men in the doorway. Rogers stood up and slammed the door in their faces. "Old fools! They were like grimacing monkeys in a zoo peering out from their cages at their betters. Brutus, when the door had closed, dropped to his haunches and waited expectantly. His jaws dripped saliva as Rogers went to the desk and cut a chunk from the steak. "Good boy!" Rogers tossed the chunk of meat. It vanished into the dog's maw, caught in mid-air. "Always hungry, aren't you?" His voice carried through the door to where Carter, surrounded by a knot of the blind men, had come to a halt. Carter's face convulsed. The men were importunate, questioning, but there was nothing he could say that could make them feel better. He shook them off. For the remainder of the day he kept to himself, and the others respected his need to be alone. No one spoke to him, even at the evening meal. There was, in fact, hardly any conversation at all at the evening meal. Ordinarily the men lingered in the dining room when they had done, or gathered in the lounge. Tonight they left the hall early and went at once to their cots, even though the room was considerably warmer than their dormitory. Long despairing, it was as if their despair had at last overwhelmed them. Carter too went at once to his cot, but sleep was impossible. His blanket provided no warmth, and the old man in the adjoining cot could not stop coughing. The coughing came at irregular intervals, long hacking spasms that threatened to fling the old man to the floor. Carter sat up. There was something different about the noises the old man was making, a note of pain. The old man, when Carter groped for him, seized his hand, gasping, "Doctor! Get a doctor!" Carter hesitated only for a moment. His flimsy dressing gown lay flung across the foot of his bed. He tugged it on hurriedly, found his cane and hurried through his perpetual darkness to the door. The rest of his way was easier. Things were rarely moved about in the halls or in the other rooms of the home, and there was no need to feel his way with the cane. Minutes later he was at another door, pounding on it. "Mr. Rogers!" It was a while before Rogers answered, but eventually there were shuffling footsteps behind the door. Rogers opened it, his hands fumbling to tie the belt of his robe. His eyes were still filled with sleep, and he was unpleasantly aware that his hair was mussed and that for the moment he did not look at all military. "So it's you!" He had half expected that it would be Carter. "What the devil do you want at this hour?" "It's Greenwood. He needs a doctor." The name meant nothing to Rogers at first. Then, "Oh yes, the old man who was constantly coughing. Can't this wait until the morning? He's bad, really bad." Rogers sought for and could find no logical excuse for returning to his bed. It was a nuisance, but he had no choice. "Okay, I'll have a look." It was amazing to him the way Carter found his way through the darkness, but he did not dwell upon it. He had tugged the collar of his robe tight about his throat, but the cold outside his own quarters was penetrating, and threading his way through the blackness in Carter's wake offended his sense of order. He should have been in the lead. He was glad when he had reached the dormitory and he could see again. The dim light from the tiny bulb in the dormitory was welcome, despite the fact that it made the men there look like cadavers on their cots. In the dormitory he took the lead as a matter of course, walking with his usual efficient military stride, and with Carter this time tapping his way behind him. He reached Greenwood's bed long before Carter bent over him and drew in his breath. He had seen that look on the faces of other men. Greenwood lay without moving, his body contorted as though he had just finished another spasm of coughing and with flecks of blood on his lips. His face seemed to have fallen in. His cheeks, always sunken, were more sunken still, and his mouth had fallen open to reveal a few remaining teeth. Rogers turned, still stooped, as Carter came up to the old man's cot. "This man's dead." When Carter said nothing, he felt the need to add something. "It must have been his heart." "It wasn't his heart." Now that Carter had come close, Rogers could see his grim face. Except for the grimness, it was expressionless, a mask carved out of stone. Whatever Carter was thinking, it was not visible on his features. Rogers straightened up with elaborate slowness. "There doesn't seem to be anything more that I can do here." "No, you've done enough." The other men had either left their cots or had propped themselves up on their elbows. Rogers could feel their hatred as they stared at him. But that was ridiculous. They could not see him. He was imagining things. He made a pretense of returning their blind stares and could not keep from recoiling. The hatred struck him like a physical blow. He backed off involuntarily, then recovered himself and walked quickly to the door. No one interfered with him. Only those blank, unseeing eyes followed him. With his going, the men turned as one to where Carter stood leaning on his cane. Gradually his look of grimness turned to a look of determination, as though he had at last decided upon a plan of action. Whatever his plan, however, it was to be several days before he put it into operation. Rogers, during those days, made it his business to see him often. Not to speak to him, but to see him, to keep tabs on him. Carter, Rogers was certain, would not react passively to Greenwood's death. Not that there was really anything that Carter could do about it, of course, but an efficient commander made it a point to keep a weather eye upon the enemy. Still, with the passing of time, there seemed to be no point in continuing his surveillance. Indeed, he felt rather foolish. What could a pack of blind men do except endure? The residents of the home, Carter included, went about their days as usual. If there was a difference in their attitude, it was merely in their murmured conversations. The conversations invariably died when Rogers came near and were not resumed until he had passed out of earshot. Well, let 'em have their piddling secrets. There was really, however, only one secret. The men shared it between them, and even if Rogers had been aware of it, he would have not understood it. How, for example, could he possibly have understood about the sausage? On the third night after Greenwood's death, the men were served sausages and beans for dinner. 1 sausage per man, together with a dollop of beans. Hardly enough to fill their empty bellies. Yet the men, after they had returned to their tables with their portions, did not immediately begin to eat. They sat each with his food before him, unmoving. Carter was the first. Carter did a very strange thing. Very carefully, as though it were part of a ritual, he cut his sausage in half. 1 half he left on his plate, the other half he placed in a large bowl. Then he passed the bowl to the man beside him. The second man too cut his sausage in half. 1 half he left on his plate, the other half he placed in the bowl before he passed that bowl to the next man. This man repeated his actions, as did the next, and the next. Eventually the bowl was returned to Carter, filled to overflowing. He had been eating what was left of his sausage, but he stopped, put both hands around the rim of the bowl and held it like something precious. If Rogers had been there, he would have seen that the expression on Carter's face duplicated exactly the expression of determination that he had worn on the night of Greenwood's death. Afterward, Carter and the others sat in their shadowy dormitory, clustered about the bowl of sausage halves. They were shivering, but for once they did not seem to mind. Toward midnight, Carter got to his feet and dropped his blanket on his cot. He was fully dressed. "It's time," he said. 2 other men, also fully dressed, came to stand beside him. They and Carter left the dormitory together, with Carter carrying the bowl of sausages. In the hall he led the way with the ease of long familiarity. Darkness was his natural element, and there was almost a spring in his step. Only when he had reached the hallway that led to Rogers's office did he slow his pace. The hallway, like the rest of the home, was still, but he waited in the gloom outside Rogers's door until he was certain that there was no one inside. What followed was like a continuation of the ritual that had begun in the dining hall. Almost smiling, Carter placed one of the sausage halves on the floor in front of the door, and then went on down the hall, leaving another bit of sausage on the floor after each few paces. The sausages made a trail that led the length of the hallway, through another door, and down a flight of stairs to the cellar. In the cellar, the 3 blind men settled themselves to wait. The trail of sausages that led down into the cellar was invisible, but they had the satisfying knowledge that it was there. "Do you suppose he'll come?" "He'll come." Carter spoke with deadly certainty. "He always comes back to his office late on Thursdays, and this is Thursday. All we have to do is wait." There was no other sound. Even had there been any, it would have penetrated only faintly to the cellar. But the blind men could hear Rogers's footsteps clearly when he came along the dark hallway. The hallway was directly above their heads. They could tell exactly what he was doing. He came along the hallway with Brutus beside him, opened his office door with a key and went inside. When he had switched on a light, he busied himself at his desk. He had work to do, and he did not notice that Brutus had not followed him into the office. Brutus, dribbling saliva, had picked up on the scent of the first bit of sausage and quickly located it in the darkness. He gulped it hungrily, found the next piece and moved on down the trail, chewing as he went. At the cellar door he hesitated for a moment. The cellar was unfamiliar to him, but the scent of sausages was irresistible. His feet padded on the stairs. On every other step he found another morsel. Below he moved in darkness so black that it made the darkness in the hallway seem almost light by comparison, but he was not aware of the difference. The trail of sausages drew him like a magnet, across the cellar floor, past a heavy door that he did not see, and into a coal shed. One of the blind men whispered to Carter, "He's inside." "Good." Carter's voice was a sibilant hiss. He moved across the cellar, found the door of the coal shed and swung it shut behind Brutus. Brutus inside was gobbling greedily. He was hardly aware of the slight sound behind him. Carter pushed home the stout sliding latch that held the door closed. His face bore a look of satisfaction, the satisfaction that a man feels when he has successfully completed part one of a difficult operation. "Now for Rogers," he said, and led the way toward the stairs. Above, Rogers had looked up from the papers on which he had been working and was looking around his office. He had long since become accustomed to the silence of the home, but tonight the silence seemed to have taken on a special quality. For some reason that he could not fathom, he was uneasy. The silence was too deep, too complete. A brooding, threatening silence that made him glad that Brutus was close at hand. "Brutus?" Brutus was not in the room. Frowning, Rogers went around his desk to the half-open door. "Brutus!" There was no sound from beyond the door. The dog, if he was in the corridor, did not respond. "Brutus!" Blast this darkness! Rogers felt a momentary stab of anger. Even had Brutus been there, he would not have been able to see him. He half-turned, peering into the shadows. A white cane whipped into view just below his chin, its tip pointing directly at his chest. Before he was aware of what was happening, 3 blind men had swarmed out of the blackness and shoved him against the wall, holding him there. One of the men was Carter. It happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that for the moment Rogers did not resist. The men seemed to have come out of nowhere. Then he found his voice. "What is this? What do you want? Go back to your quarters, all of you." Carter, as always, was the spokesman. "It's our turn to give the orders, Mr. Rogers." "Orders? You?" Fear and indignation struggled for ascendancy in Rogers' voice. Indignation won. "How dare you? The men did not seem to hear him. They had gripped his arms and were dragging him down the hallway, and they were surprisingly strong for all their emaciation. Struggle as he might, he could not break free. "Brutus! Help me! Brutus!" The men who dragged him were shadows, silent shadows who held him with grips of iron, their fingers biting into his flesh. "Please! Where are you taking me?" He had to break free, to run. They were mad. His struggles became a frenzy, to no avail. At the end he could no longer even keep his footing. The men had begun to hurry, so that he was yanked off his feet and dragged with his toes scraping the wooden floor. He could see nothing, hear nothing except his own gasping breath. The stairs! He was being hauled down a flight of stairs into a blackness even more profound than the blackness above. The cellar! He could no longer feel the hands that had been holding him. Instead, he was being pushed violently from behind. He stumbled, grabbed at the handrail halfway down the stairs to save himself from falling. But he could not see. Momentum carried him on downward. At the bottom of the stairs he stumbled again and fell to his hands and knees. He did not know that the other blind men were waiting for him until he felt their hands clutching at him, lifting him to his feet. "Brutus!" Somewhere close by, Brutus barked a reply. Rogers could hear him. But where was he? Where? Suddenly the cellar was brightly lit. Carter, still at the head of the stairs, had flicked the light switch. Rogers did not see him, did not look up. He was searching wildly for Brutus as he struggled. The barking was somewhere not more than a few yards away, but he could not locate its source. There were at least a dozen of the blind men holding him, staring men without expression who closed in on him, herded him like some beast across the cellar toward a coal shed. There were 2 coal sheds. One was locked and bolted, the door of the second hung open. It was toward the second that he was being driven. "No, don't!" The words ended in a wail as the men shoved him through the opening, swung the door shut and held it closed. It was not until then that Carter descended the cellar stairs. He walked deliberately to the coal shed and slid its latch home. Then he and the others turned, still deliberately, and left the cellar. Their deathly silence, even more than what had happened, had shaken Rogers, transformed him into jelly. But with their going, reason began to return to him. When he was quite certain that they had gone, he turned to an inspection of his prison. There was no way out. The shed was solidly built, without a chink, and the door was massive, heavy. Thick iron bars crisscrossed a tiny window set high in the cellar wall. He tried the door, but without any real hope. It did not budge. Suddenly furious, he stamped his shoulder against it. Instantly there was a response. Brutus, in the shed alongside, began to bark furiously. Rogers whirled, still not understanding. The sound was coming from that wall, the wall between the 2 sheds. Noise reverberated hollowly through the cellar as the dog hurled itself against the wall. Understanding drew a pattern of fear across Rogers's face. They had locked Brutus in too. The fear made his voice a whisper when he spoke again. He did not speak angrily or with indignation this time. His one word was not even a cry for help. It was a whisper of despair. "Brutus!" The remainder of that night was a bad dream in which he racked his brain for a clue as to what might happen next. A night without rest, its silence broken only when Brutus, raging at his confinement, threw himself again and again at the wall. No one came to the cellar. The helpless calm of desperation had clamped a fist about him by the time the blind men did return. They came early the next morning, carrying hammers and saws, and bent under the weight of the scrap wood they were carrying, and went to work. Rogers did not call out to them, certain that it would avail him nothing even if he did so. Instead he tried to puzzle out what they were doing. They were building something. That much was obvious from the hammering and the sound of sawing, but what it could be was beyond him. From time to time he could hear Carter's voice giving directions of some sort, but the words were unintelligible. "Carter!" Rogers's tongue writhed around the name. Oh, he would have a score to settle with Carter when this idiotic charade was over. Meanwhile he listened. The men in the cellar worked steadily, not pausing to rest. What were they doing? The attendant in Rogers's office above wondered too. He had, since greeting Rogers on his first day at the home, spent more of his time attending to Rogers's needs than to the needs of his charges. The coffee he carried had become a daily chore, but when he had set the coffee down on the desk he did not leave the office at once. Somewhere in the building someone was building something, and he knew of no construction work being done in the home. Curious, he went out, following the sound. Rogers, had he known of the man's curiosity, might have felt a thrill of hope, but he did not know of it. He huddled in his coal shed, grimed with black dust and feeling the first insistent pangs of hunger, and listened. Carter's voice came to him again through the rasping of saws and the pounding of hammers. When they let him out? But what if they did not let him out? What if they meant to keep him here until he starved? His thoughts of retribution dissolved, left him with only his fear. He banged on the door. "Look, what are you doing out there?" The sawing and the hammering ceased. All work had halted as the blind men turned their faces in the direction of the shed. Back to work! Carter too had turned his face toward the shed, but only for a moment. The men returned to their tasks. Somewhere above them a door creaked. The attendant had followed the noise to the cellar. He did not come down the stairs. He took half a step forward and a cane slammed down in front of him, barring his way. He leaped back, startled. A blind man stood at the top of the stairs, his cane held out to make a horizontal barrier. The blind man did not raise his voice, but there was an intensity in it that made the attendant recoil. "Don't come down here and don't call anyone if you value your life. Just go about your work." The attendant shrank away and the door closed. The men continued with their labours. Brutus had resumed his barking and some of the men turned their faces again toward the coal sheds. There was a new vicious note to the barking now. It seemed to give them satisfaction, but they did not pause. Rogers heard it too. His fist pounded on the door of the shed. "You out there!" The hammering and the sawing went on. "Feed Brutus! Please, he's hungry!" If the blind men were aware of his voice at all, they chose to ignore him. If anything, the tempo of the hammering increased. Only Carter paid any attention. He walked to the shed and waited. He did not have to wait long. Inside the shed, Rogers was still at the door, sickly aware that only a single wall separated him from Brutus. "Look, you must feed him. He'll get wild. He'll be dangerous." It was almost a scream. Carter, waiting, said, "I know," very quietly, and then inclined his head toward the shed that held Brutus. Brutus was in a near frenzy. His barking had become a continuous staccato. Behind his door, Rogers shuddered as the dog held himself against the wall that divided them. He could see Brutus in his mind's eye, lips pulled away from his teeth in a snarl. He had owned Brutus for years, but there had never been the usual man and his dog relationship between them. Brutus had never been a pet. He was a weapon, a deadly weapon. If another few hours passed and he was not fed... Rogers backed away from the wall in a cold sweat. For a moment he thought of clawing his way up to the tiny barred window, then dismissed the idea as impractical. The bars were too strong, the window too small for him to squeeze through, even had he been able to reach it. He retreated to a corner of the shed and sat down, his eyes fixed on the small patch of sky that showed between the bars. He sat so through all of that day, until the sky was no longer visible. Then he slept fitfully, alternately sweating and shivering, tormented by dreams that were nightmares and by the hunger that gnawed at his insides. But it was the uncertainty of not knowing what the blind men were planning that was the hardest to bear. He had had an insane desire to scream at them, to curse them, to rage at them when the sounds of their hammering and of Brutus's howling woke him the next morning. Only the few shreds of self-control that still remained to him kept his lips clamped shut. That satisfaction at least he could deny them. The work, whatever it was, continued all through the day and well into the night. Huddled in his corner, Rogers did not move. He was filthy, with 2 days' growth of beard stubbling a jaw that had set stubbornly, despite his weakness and the growling of his empty stomach. It was the cessation of the hammering and the sawing that drove him to the door again, straining to hear. There was something final about the sudden silence that had affected even Brutus. He had momentarily quit his howling. Rogers's pounding on the door was weak, ineffectual, but loud enough to be heard. "What have you made?" Carter's voice came to him through the door. "You will see, Mr. Rogers. You will see." "I haven't had any food in 2 days. Give me some food, please." The words stuck in his throat. "Do you call what you have been feeding us food, Mr. Rogers?" There was the same finality in Carter's voice that there had been in the sudden silence. It made Rogers's blood run cold, but when he spoke he managed to speak placatingly. "Well, look, please at least feed Brutus. Put the food under his door. Look, he'll kill anyone who sets foot in there now." For reply there was the unexpected sound of a bolt being drawn. The door of the coal shed swung open. Rogers drew back, wary, but there was no other movement in the darkness. He could see nothing, 2 or 3 dim shadows no more, until one of the shadows stepped forward. Carter. He could tell from the voice that it was Carter. You are free to go now, Mr. Rogers." Carter and the other shadows turned and walked away. 3 steps was enough to lose them in the gloom. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. But anything was better than the coal shed. Rogers moved out of the shed slowly, setting one foot carefully before the other, but not into the cellar. The cellar had changed. By straining his eyes he could see that he stood in a crudely built, tunnel-like wooden corridor. The corridor stretched away from him. How far was impossible to tell, but at the end of it there seemed to be a second corridor that turned off at a sharp angle from the first. This was what the blind men had been building. They were insane. Very weak and very frightened, Rogers strained to make out details and could see none. A bark made him turn toward the other coal shed, but the door to the prison that confined Brutus would have been invisible even had his eyes been able to pierce the darkness. One wall of the corridor in which he stood had been built between the door of his shed and the door of the other. Whatever lurked ahead, he would have to chance it. His skin crawled as he walked forward, but he forced himself on, feeling his way. It was like being in a tunnel. A crazy tunnel constructed of bits and pieces of scrap lumber, but a tunnel nonetheless. At the far end of the tunnel he turned right into the corridor that led off from it, still feeling his way. There was no way of knowing how far he had come, when he felt the sharp, cutting sensation in his hand and he heard his own voice cry out in pain. He drew the hand back from the wall as if from a hot iron and brought it close to his face. Blood was oozing from a deep gash in his palm. Of course, the crazy patchwork that the blind men had built would necessarily be rough, studded with protruding nails. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the lights came on, and enough of the light penetrated the corridor so that he could see. There were no protruding nails. Directly ahead of him, the corridor narrowed for a few yards like the neck of a funnel before widening out again. Along those few yards the blind men had fastened horizontal planks, and in each of the planks they had embedded bits of metal that glistened cruelly. The bits of metal were razor blades, hundreds of them. He did not stop to think about it. He had to get out. Slowly, he moved forward, the walls narrowing in on him as he went. There was scarcely a hair breadth between his vulnerable flesh and the razor blades as he inched his way past them. One step at a time, not even daring to breathe, he continued on. Only a few moments passed, really, but it seemed like hours. Then he was past the razor blades unharmed, and the corridor widened out. His sigh of relief whistled between his teeth. Hurrying now, he went ahead. There was another bend just ahead of him. He turned into it, walked a dozen paces, and there was still another bend, to the left this time. He did not want to go on. If there was madness here, it was madness with a method at whose ultimate goal he could only guess. It made him stop, think. Minutes passed while he hesitated. Then, his mind made up, he turned into the next corridor and came to a dead halt. The way ahead of him was short and straight, and it led directly to the door of the coal shed in which Brutus had raged and starved for 2 days. He did not instantly recognize the shed for what it was, but he did not have to. He could hear Brutus inside it. Brutus was very hungry, and he had sensed that someone was outside. His massive body crashed against the door like a battering ram. Rogers's stare went to the bolt. He was praying that it would hold. There was a string fastened to the bolt. It led to a tiny hole in the wall of the corridor, and as he watched the string, it began to draw taut. No! The string was already drawing the bolt from its latch. His frantic leap forward was too late to prevent it. He ran, his face contorted with terror. Turned right at the corner of the short corridor, left at the next. Behind him, the door of the coal shed flew open and Brutus burst into the tunnel, slavering his teeth bared. The sound of his snarling drove Rogers on like a lash. Another turn. Rogers was moaning now, mouthing meaningless words as he fled. If he could get back to his own coal shed and slam it shut, he would be safe. There was no other haven he could run to. Brutus, howling his hunger, had taken up the chase. It was coming fast. One more turn. Rogers froze. Ahead of him was the spot in the tunnel where the walls narrowed and converged. He could see the razor blades. Back! He had to go back. He whirled. Brutus was just behind him. Every detail of glistening fangs and glaring eyes and drawn-back lips imprinted itself on his consciousness before he turned and rushed towards the razor blades. There was no other way to go. He had almost reached the razor blades when Carter, waiting with the other blind men at the head of the cellar stairs, placed a finger on the light switch and the tunnel went black. The faces of the blind men did not change. Not even when they heard Rogers's blood-curdling shriek. Rogers tried to shake his head, to collect his thoughts, but he could not move. It's true. I was on my way to a new job as superintendent. I don't even know why I stopped here. I do. The monk's voice brought him all the way back to reality. The others sat as Rogers sat, as if hypnotized, unable to stare. Dead. Nothing. No one stared. Only the monk's eyes seemed able to see. They moved from one rigid face to another and came to rest on the face of Jason. And now you may go. Behind the monk, the stone door swung open. Jason hesitated, then stood up and walked toward it, expressionless. It was not until he had reached the door that his face became mobile again. It writhed, twisted, as Rogers's face had twisted. There was no room, no chamber beyond the door. There was a pit, and in the pit there was something molten, something fiery, bubbling, something that seethed like the inside of a volcano. Plumes of flame reached upward, reeking of some stuff that Jason could not identify, that contorted his mouth, stung his nostrils. Yet even then he did not really understand. He whirled to face the monk. But how can we? There was no way out, not through there. This was some monstrous joke. Where are we? In a place where people go when they have died without repenting. You see, I was not warning you, but telling you why you are here. For all eternity. Then Jason understood. The monk extended his hands, and it was as if a great wind took Jason and hurled him back through the open doorway. He fell screaming and dissolved into nothingness, became one with the seething mass in the pit. His screams were still echoing when the others too stood and walked toward the doorway. They walked slowly, automatons driven on by a power that could not be denied, and hurtled downward, 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 screaming, screaming, and screaming as Jason had screamed. William Rogers's fateful story, Blind Alleys, was written by Jack Oleck and narrated, sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. And so, my friends, we finally reached the end of our Tales from the Crypt nightmare, if indeed it was only a nightmare. Either way, here endeth the lesson. And I do hope that you will heed my warning. After all, forewarned is indeed forearmed. But do please stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, because very soon I shall be bringing you yet another anthology of fearful, fateful tales. Again written by Jack Oleck and narrated by Chris Harvey, and where, if you dare to come along for the ride, we shall together descend into the dank, dark depths of the Vault of Horror.